A trend tells us a lot about watches. The fashion and the image associated to them drives us to aspire to own one. So in the case of today's piece, for the longest time, I never paid much attention to it. It gave me the impression of being the odd one out. I'm not talking about a double red Sea Dweller, a Commando dial Explorer, or a double Swiss pre-Newman Daytona, but the Explorer 1655. To this day, a watch that I believe to be the most fascinating Rolex ever made. The first Explorer II, a true professional's watch, introduced to revitalize the Explorer line. At the time in the early 70s, some at Rolex felt the traditional design of the Explorer I was fatiguing. It had made a name for itself, and had given Rolex an avenue that others didn't have. It was a watch that summited Everest. But being the company aimed at putting their watches in extreme places, they wanted to bring in a piece that would do two things: offer opportunity for adventurers of a different caliber, but also create an opportunity to make the watches more functional. The goal of the exercise was to target not only mountaineers, but cave explorers. In a broader sense of the word, speleology, people who specialize in the study of caves, volcanology, the study of volcanoes. Then you have caving and the spelunking audience, which is a group of people who pursue the idea of cave exploration, more along the lines of a recreational activity. So much like amateur and professional divers, we have amateur and professional cave explorers. When you think about it to that extent, the idea of such a watch is a brilliant concept, and the complication chosen was just as brilliant, giving the user the ability to know whether the time is ante-meridium or post-meridium, AM or PM. For those of you who don't know, real cave explorers can spend days away from the sun, and so having no sense of the time, the day or the date, could find themselves lost. I have been in a situation where I have spent a little over a day traveling through a network of caves as a group and I were going across a mountain. And speaking from experience, it is a very real scenario. You have no idea which way is up. So to cater for the concept of knowing the time of day, the idea of using a GMT movement would suit the purpose perfectly. This watch was also designed with the intention of being a valuable guide for explorers on the poles. There are times of the year when the sun doesn't rise in these areas, and similarly the sun never sets. The process began by taking a Gmt case. It's not too difficult to determine which generation of case was used, and you can judge by the size of the crown guards. The common case was most likely a 1675 reference. Then the watch was fitted with a fixed steel bezel. This is one core element that links all Explorer pieces together, and has ever since. Let's discuss that quickly because I believe it to be very important for this line of pieces. A fixed bezel is a perfect option for purpose. Again, referring back to my time when I was passing through caves, the team and I did a considerable amount of climbing and abseiling. For those of you who don't know, the majority of the time you're doing these things, your arms and hands are virtually scraping rock faces. There is continual contact between you and rock surfaces. The odds of the watch colliding with a surface is high, much higher than most situations. So the fixed bezel allows for that rigidity that a rotating bezel wouldn't offer, and the chances of you losing the bezel is high in scenarios like these. You want zero margin for error, basically. If it isn't already clear, mountains, rock climbing and caving is an extremely rough exercise. If you want to see what true wear and tear is, expose your watch to that environment. The Explorer's fixed bezel had numerals machined into it and filled with black paint, indicating every second hour in a 24-hour day. This was a clever approach to keep the GMT complication both functional and practical, since the large GMT hand was synchronized to the hour hand. Then the watch went in a radical direction with its dial, and this direction is what I believe makes the watch divisive. Back then in the 70s it was considered extreme. It's safe to say that the dial is the element that detracts the design for most people. The format opted for an entirely square marker format at each point and an enlarged minute track. So why were the indices placed this way around the dial? This was done with purpose. Since the bezel would not illuminate, it was thought that the markers would allow for easier legibility when it came to discerning the 24-hour time. What is interesting on closer inspection is that the numerals consist of three separate sizes. The quarters at the 6 and the 9 position are the largest, along with the triangle, followed by the indexes at every hour point afterwards. Then the smallest squares are used for the remaining hours on the 24-hour bezel. We'll get back to discussing the dial. Next, the hands. They were conceived to be the most legible hands possible, and I think these were the greatest successes with the watch. If it wasn't for the hands, I don't think this design would have worked anywhere near as well as it does. The hands really tie the piece together. First, the hour and the minute hand. Painted stark white and given a touch of black at the base allows for them to disconnect from the dial and almost float in the space. The hour hand is short and fat, and the minute hand is long and thin. They are both easy to discern at a glance. Then a pop of orange from the oversized GMT hand. This is the watch's USP. Easy to spot and follow. More often than not, the wearer is compelled to read the orange hand instead of the hour hand to tell the time, since it stands out so much. As an ensemble with the white seconds hand, it makes the wearer feel like they are using something more akin to a compass. And really the blend of all these hands gives off that instrumental feel. This doesn't feel like a watch, a piece of luxury. It really is a tool in the purest sense of the word. With all of that exposition out of the way, let's get into more detail about the designed aspects of the watch. Why do I believe it to be one of the most fascinating Rolexes ever made? One core detail. There is not another mainstream Rolex that has ever come close to this piece with regards to originality. Just focusing on the dial and the hands, this piece is wholly unique. Speaking as a designer, I love the method chosen to use a symmetrical square rectangle shape throughout the dial. Coupled with the pencil-shaped hands, the elements tie together so well. And quite honestly, if other approaches were taken, the watch would lose a lot of what makes it so interesting. Here's an example. On the left we have a standard dial, and on the right we have a dial with rounded plots. Immediately you'd say that the right piece looks more like the modern Explorers we see today. And yes, I would argue that the rounded plots make the watch more legible, but it just loses me. It loses that element of streamlining that the original dial has. So on to a more critical look at the piece. I'm probably not the only one that says that this watch is difficult to read. It is hard to tell the time at a glance, unless you take the time to look at it for a few seconds more. This is simply attributed to cluttering. There is too much going on at once. What makes it easier to work with is the fact that the numerals are so small. This allows for the hands to take center stage, and in that way your eye can browse the dial easier. But like with anything that is cool and unique, like the clutch on a vintage car, learning to read the dial is a part of the fun, wouldn't you say? I think it is quite an endearing feature about the watch, personally. Next, let's talk about the crystal. As mentioned before, anything to do with rocks and caves is rough. Now this is a debatable point, but I think if any watch needed a sapphire crystal to be introduced, it would have been this watch. Of course, the crystal is more brittle and would chip, but the acrylic would get marred very easily. Also, the Cyclops Lens. Yes, it makes viewing the date easier, something that is important when you are wanting to know 24-hour time, but sticking out like that is just asking for it to be scraped off. But these are just nitpicks. Let's talk about the modern iterations that were introduced and that are now part of the modern Rolex lineup. Looking at how the 1655 established the genre, I think that there is something lost between it and the newer references. When I see these pieces side by side, my heart is just not compelled to be interested in the modern pieces. That's not to say that they aren't loved by people. These watches now have a huge following. But why do I say that? Well, the dial is probably the biggest culprit. It just looks like every other Submariner and GMT dial. Yes, it is a good formula, but the uniqueness is lost. Looking at the new 42mm references, again, like I said about the hands, I just don't think the Mercedes hour hand is necessary. It would look so much cooler if it was a pencil hand instead. The rounded indices are cool and make the watch more legible, but they are stealing the flame from the Submariner and the GMT. Now people just see this watch as a GMT with a fixed bezel, and not as a watch designed initially for cave exploration. The one element I do appreciate is the orange GMT hand. Bringing it over to the new references was an awesome idea, and the way the bezel is treated with the small triangles highlighting the hours. The modern versions look a lot cleaner, some would say a lot plainer, and that plays to the watch's strengths as a functional tool. But now, just for fun, I'm going to play around with some concepts. As always, I'm not trying to tell you that this is the way the watch should be. I think it is important, however, to challenge the status quo sometimes. What I've done is try to recreate the vintage design with the modern iteration. On the left you see the standard black dial Explorer 42, and on the right a watch more reminiscent of the original Explorer II. The most notable change was how the indices were handled. I made them vary in size. Now these numerals could be adjusted, of course, but the idea is to highlight every plot on the 24-hour bezel. And notice that I removed the Mercedes hand and replaced it with a pencil hand. In my eyes, I see this to be a more unique watch in the lineup. It is unlike any of the others, which makes it more interesting. Now yes, it might lose legibility, but in saying that, for us who enjoy these vintage pieces, there is no denying that this watch now looks like a tool. and maybe it's cool for your eyes to be lost in the details sometimes. And then taking the concept further and introducing a polar dial and a negative dial just adds that little bit of intrigue to the equation. I particularly like the idea of a negative dial, where the dial itself is loomed and the numerals and hands are blacked out. I could see this piece becoming very popular. But in closing, I want to hone in on the fact that I find this watch to be brilliant. The 1655 to me is a piece of art. It is so abstract but so nicely built for purpose. And even now, years later, this piece looks incredible. It hasn't aged. And as a designer, it is my role to say that this piece does not fill every purpose it was intended for. Yes, there are areas in need of improvement, like the layout on the dial, like the size of the indices. Yes, it is polarizing. But in the case of this watch, these little idiosyncrasies make it all the more interesting from an academic point of view. The watch becomes something that an enthusiast would want to study and not just look at. It is a watch to me that is more fascinating than any Paul Newman Daytona, GMT or Submariner. It was a flash in the pan that brought the Explorer line into the modern era and has since become a legend. I find it sad that a design like this has not continued. The words creative and experimental come to mind, and with that said, I plan on doing a second part of this video offering a suggestion to see it evolve in the future.